Well, in case you're not sure, Happy Easter. Happy Easter. Happy Easter. Christ is risen. And it's kind of the point, right? Is that, without Easter, we don't really have a Christian church, right? If we didn't have Easter, we'd just be a bunch of other people believing some other teacher. And not that there's anything wrong with believing a particular teacher. But Jesus was something more. Jesus did something that was kind of pretty impressive. He predicted his own death and resurrection. Now, people do that all the time. Well, not all the time, but sometimes. But he pulled it off. Right? Because Matthew, Mark, Luke, John all tell us that that's what he did. That before he was ever arrested, before we even knew, his followers even knew what was going on, Jesus said, the day will come when people will arrest me and they will kill me, and I'll be back in 3 days. That's what he said. And that's what happened. And that's what Easter is about. Now, one of the things that I like to do when we go through these kind of narratives, because if you've been a Christian for any length of time, you've heard the Christmas narrative, you've heard the Palm Sunday narrative, you've heard the Easter narrative, and so often those narratives focus on events. And the events are of course, important. But if we just look at events, it's actually hard to kind of see how these events apply to our own lives. They're just kind of distant ideas. But if we can move past the events to the people that were there with these events, and see what those people experienced during the events, we start to see how things start to apply to us. Because the reality is that people don't change much over time. Our clothing may change, our technologies may change, but fundamentally, we kind of still behave the same. And so if we can look at what happened in the lives of those first century Jesus followers, those people who were there for those events, and start to understand what those events meant to them, it can help us understand what those events mean to us. And we also find that as we look at their experiences with the events, for them, these events were not just to be experienced. For them, those events led them to take action. They actually felt that like there was something they were supposed to do because of these events. And so if we can understand their motivation for what they were supposed to do, I think it helps us understand in our own lives, what are we called to do? Because so often when we talk about the concept of Easter, we throw around words like salvation and heaven and those sort of things. And those things are, of course, important, that Jesus has redeemed us, that he has freed us from our past, he's rebuilt our relationship with God. But if we're not careful, we may be tempted to focus only on what we get out of this deal. And what we get is really important. The idea of freedom from our past, freedom from our mistakes, eternity with God. Those things are obviously super important. But Jesus also taught us that if all you see is what you get, you're missing it. That as a result of Jesus' work, we're also called to do something, to step out. We are called to make a difference somehow. Now, as we get ready to read through the narrative, the Easter narrative, what I'd like to do is set the stage a little bit. Because we experience Easter, 2,000 years later, very differently than they did. Because here, 2,000 years later, the way we generally experience the Easter season, we might start kind of with last Sunday, Palm Sunday. And we go from Palm Sunday, and you kind of travel through the week. Some folks do a kind of a Maundy Thursday thing where they celebrate kind of the Last Supper, acknowledge that Jesus was arrested. Most people kind of focus more on what we call Good Friday, which is kind of an odd name, honestly, but the day that Jesus was executed. And then what do? Right? We jump to Sunday. Easter, woo, it's all over. But for those first century Jesus followers, that is not at all how this went down. Right? For them, they had given up everything to follow Jesus. Right? That they had actually turned against the religious leadership in order to follow Jesus. And the religious leadership was incredibly powerful at that time. They were like a second government. And so people turned against that to follow Jesus. Because Jesus said all that heavy burden and rules and that stuff that they're telling you about, that's not it. Oftentimes they would have disputes within their own families because they chose to follow Jesus because that religious leadership reached in the family so deeply. So people had given up so much. And they did this because they believed that Jesus was the Messiah, that he was the one who had long been promised, who would come and would free them. But then something went wrong. He died. And so on Friday, Jesus died. And that wasn't supposed to happen, they thought. And so what happens now is that this man that they believed so much in, that they had given up so much for, is gone. And the nature of their religious practice kind of made the weight a little bit heavier, because their religious practice was that when the sun goes down on Friday, you can't do anything until the sun goes down on Saturday. That's what they call their Sabbath, and they had very strict rules around that. You couldn't go out, you couldn't work, you couldn't travel. So what happened is that they experienced this life-shattering event. Jesus has died. And they've got to live through Saturday. There were no Christians on Saturday. But if a Christian is someone who believes in Jesus, there were no Christians on Saturday. And that's what they're experiencing as we pick up our narrative today. Now, the gospel writer Mark tells us that Saturday evening, when the Sabbath ended, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, and Salome went out and purchased burial spices so they could anoint Jesus' body. And that one verse tells us a whole bunch about how things happened on Friday. So we know that early Friday morning, Jesus was sentenced to die. He spent several hours on the cross before he died. We know his body hung there for a time after that. And we know that someone did take the body down and bury it. And the way they buried it was putting him in a cave and sealing it up. But remember that the Sabbath was coming. You can't do anything on a Sabbath. So the problem was there wasn't even time to properly prepare Jesus' body for burial. So they basically just got it in the cave, sealed it up. And so these three women kind of want to make that right. So what they've done is that at the end of their Sabbath on Saturday, they've gone out to collect the supplies that they need to be able to properly prepare Jesus' body for burial. And so as we continue the narrative, very early on Sunday morning, just at sunrise, the three women went to the tomb. And on the way there, they were asking each other, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? So they're realizing they've got these really good intentions to properly prepare Jesus' body, but they're not even sure how they're going to get to it, because it would have been a huge boulder sealing up the cave. But as they arrived, they looked up and saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled aside. Now we see that, we go, it's Easter, Jesus is risen. That's not what they thought. Things just got worse for them. Their friend, their teacher, their rabbi, Jesus, had died on Friday. They're going to take care of his body, and someone's gotten into the grave. They're afraid of one of two things having just happened. One, the people broke into the grave and stole Jesus' body. Or, even worse than that, Jesus had lots of enemies. They're afraid that someone has broken into this grave and desecrated his body. That's what they're thinking when they see that the rock has been rolled away. They are not happy or excited at all, but they want to know. So they go into the tomb. And when they entered the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a white robe sitting on the right side. The women were shocked. Now they're shocked because it turns out that this person, that they believe is a person, turns out to be an angel. And the gospel writer Luke goes on to tell us what the words from the angel are. Why are you looking among the dead for someone who is alive? He isn't here. He's risen from the dead. And I love the way this is characterized. You're looking at a place where dead things are. Your teacher, your rabbi is not dead. The person you believed in is not dead. Dead things go in dead places. Living things go in living places. He's alive. He's not here. So as the angel continues, remember what he told you back in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be betrayed into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and that he would rise again on the third day. Then they remembered what Jesus had said. And this is something really important. The angel is pointing out, I think, something we can take into our own lives. Right? When you step out to do big things, when you step out to do hard things, when you feel like God is leading you to do something that's kind of scary, kind of big, kind of a little past what you can do, along the way, it is going to feel like things have gone completely wrong. That because you're hitting obstacles, because things aren't going quite like you expect, you can be tempted to believe that the whole thing is going to fail. But that's kind of the journey. What the angel is basically saying here is that don't let your circumstances fool you. Sometimes things do feel like they're going wrong. But sometimes the hard path is the path that leads us to where we're supposed to be. And for these three women, effectively what each angel is saying is that, look, I know things feel bad now, but this is what he told you about. This was a path that was necessary. This is what was necessary for you to find freedom. He was willing to walk this hard road for them, for you, for me, because that creates freedom. And in this exchange, these three women remember. Now notice what the angel says next. Now go and tell his disciples, including Peter, that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see Jesus there, just as he told you before he died. Look at that very first thing. Go and tell. The angel didn't say go to church. Right? The angel didn't say go to do a bunch of religious stuff. What did the angel say? Now that you understand what Jesus was up to, now that you understand why this is important, don't just hold on to it. Go tell somebody else. You have gained a precious understanding. Share that with other people. So right from the very beginning, go share what you know with someone else. And notice it says, go tell his disciples, including Peter. Why does he name Peter? There were at least 11 disciples behind. Actually, there were actually many more than that, but 11 core disciples that were still around. Why does he name Peter specifically? Because Peter had thought he completely failed. Remember that if you know the longer version of the narrative, that as Jesus was arrested, Peter initially tried to follow him. But then people asked Peter, hey, do you know that Jesus guy? And what did Peter say? No. To protect himself, which seems pretty reasonable, to protect himself, he said no. But not once, but said it 3 times. He was asked 3 different times, and every time, more vehemently, he said no. To the point that it's recorded on the 3rd time, he literally begins swearing up and down that I don't know who this guy is. Why are you bothering me with this? And then Jesus died. And so Peter is carrying that guilt. And the message here is really clear. We all make mistakes. We all fall down. We all get it wrong sometimes. Sometimes we fail in big ways. Sometimes we fail in huge ways. But that doesn't separate you from God. In fact, the message here is really clear. When you're feeling down, when you feel like you've blown it, when you feel crushed and beaten, God actually calls out for you specifically. God seeks you to bring you closer. That our mistakes do not separate us from God. God seeks us out more deeply when we feel like we've gotten it wrong. So now these women, remembering what Jesus told them, actually head out now. that after a time, he would return. So then the Apostle John goes on to tell us that Sunday evening the disciples were meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. And the issue here is that the religious leaders killed Jesus for a reason. Right? He was messing up their gig, right? They had this whole thing in place that gave them power. And Jesus was messing with that. And they figured one way to deal with that was to kill Jesus. But what these other disciples are worried about is that maybe those religious leaders aren't satisfied just killing Jesus. You know, maybe they're going to look for some of these other guys to get rid of too. So they locked themselves away because they're afraid of what's going to happen. But then John goes on to tell us, suddenly Jesus was standing there among them. Peace be with you, he said. And as Jesus spoke, he showed them the wounds in his hand and his side. And they were filled with joy when they saw their Lord. They were filled with joy, not because they saw a hallucination, or not because they saw a ghost. They were filled with joy because their rabbi and teacher and friend was standing right in front of them with the wounds that he had suffered in his execution. The promise that Jesus said that he would rise again had been fulfilled. You know, and I really believe that not only are these disciples joyful, I think that Jesus was joyful. Jesus had always known this event was coming, and he always knew how important it was. And he's on the other side of that now. And he's now with his disciples with the opportunity to help them understand. He had been explaining this to me. He had been explaining this to them for years, and they never quite got it. And now they're finally starting to get it. And I think Jesus was really joyful about that. And notice the next thing Jesus says. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you." In other words, you now understand that you are now among the first to understand what the work of Jesus was about. First of all, don't let that disturb you. Find peace in that. Find comfort in that. But also find confidence in that. And then what Jesus says next is kind of the same sort of thing the angels said. Well, now that you understand, what does Jesus say to do? As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you. Now that you understand, it is time to go to work. It is time to go out there and share what you have found, this peace that you have found. Share that. This renewed life that you have found. Share that. This restoration that you're experiencing in your life, go and share that with somebody else. And this is an idea that Jesus repeats over and over again. Don't just embrace what you have received for yourself. Go out and share it with someone else. And we actually see this kind of same sort of exchange happen sometime later. We don't really know how much later. We know that some amount of time has gone by since this initial encounter between Jesus and his disciples. But it seems that Jesus has been missing for a bit. And what I mean by missing is that they just haven't seen him for a bit. Now, Jesus gave them really clear instructions, right? Go out and share this with someone else. But it doesn't seem that they actually did that. It seems like they were kind of sitting back, waiting for Jesus to come tell them something else to do. Like, that can't be it. You mean I'm just supposed to go tell people? Well, that can't be it. It must be more complicated than that. But Jesus waits. And as Jesus waits before he visits them again, it seems like they've kind of gotten uncomfortable. And so they start to seek comfort in something that's familiar. You know, and I wonder how often that happens in our own lives. I'll speak of my own life. That when things are disturbing and are not quite going the way that I want them to, and there are things that are not really the best place to put my attention, but as time goes on, I find myself trying to be comfortable by looking at those things or doing those things that I know weren't really good for me. And I think it's what happens to the disciples as well. Because after some time, they go back to old habits. Now for them, what were their old habits? Well, they used to earn a living fishing. So since I don't know what to do, I'll just go back to my old job. Right? Even though Jesus had given them a new job. So they go out fishing. And while they're out there fishing, because this would have been something they had done since they were children, so it would actually make them really comfortable, while they're out there, they see somebody on the beach. They can't quite make him out at first. But as they look more closely, they realize it's Jesus. So they rush to get to the beach. And as they get there, Jesus is doing something that would have been unimaginable to them. He was cooking breakfast. And the reason that would have been unimaginable, because Jesus was their friend, but he was also their rabbi, their respected teacher. And in that culture, in that system, you rose up. And once you reached a certain level, it wasn't your responsibility to do those sort of things anymore. The disciples served the teacher. The teacher didn't serve the disciples. But here is Jesus is, serving them, demonstrating that Jesus has flipped the script around. In the old religious system, the more time you were in it, the more privilege you had, the more people adapted to you. And Jesus is saying that's not how this works anymore. The more you understand, the more time you are in it, the more responsibility you have to serve other people. And that's what Jesus was doing. And think about how Peter must have felt. I mean, Peter's still carrying all that guilt about how he had denied he even knew who Jesus was. And here Jesus is saying, I made you breakfast. Have a seat. And Jesus serves him breakfast. So they sit down and they have breakfast. And one of the apostles who were there actually tells us about this exchange between Jesus and Peter. It says that after breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Now that's a pretty ambiguous question. What is these? Well, it turns out that even people who write kind of big, thick Bible commentaries aren't even sure what these is. There's kind of three possible explanations that are largely agreed upon. When Jesus says, you love me more than these, one option is, hey, Peter, do you love me more than these other disciples do? That's one option. Second one is, hey, Peter, do you love me more than you love the other disciples? But I think the third one might be it. Hey, Peter, do you love me more than those things that give you comfort? That boat, that fishing equipment, this place which has been yours for so long you can just hang on to it? Do you love me more than those things? And of course, Peter says, yes, Lord, you know I love you. And what does Jesus say? Then feed my lambs. Now, Jesus asked Peter the same question twice more. Hey, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yes, Lord, you know I do. Then Jesus says, take care of my sheep. And then Jesus asks it again. Hey, Peter, do you love me? Yes, you know I do. Then feed my sheep. Now, why does Jesus do this 3 times? Now, some speculation is that Jesus did this 3 times to try to offset Peter's 3 times of having doubt, to try to kind of create some kind of balance of restoration there. But we know that's not really how Jesus works. Trust me, if I had to pay for every individual thing I have ever fallen down on, for every person I have hurt, every time I've done damage in someone else's life, I'm going to need a lot more than 3 tries to clean that up. Jesus cleaned it all up at once. So I don't think that's it. I think there's a few things going on here. And first of all, I think that Jesus is being abundantly clear that our mistakes don't disqualify us. Earlier, Jesus had told Peter that you're my number 1 guy. The time is coming when I'm going to leave and I want you to be in charge. And I think Jesus is making it really, really clear that yes, you've made mistakes, but that doesn't disqualify you. You're still my guy. You're still the one I want to be in charge. You've made mistakes there. You know what? You're going to make them again. Do what you can. Try to do better, but those things don't disqualify you. Fundamentally, it comes down to the fact that our relationship with Jesus does not require us to be perfect, because that would be impossible. But also, I think the really big point here, when Jesus says, do you love me more than these? That temptation to love privilege that comes with being around a long time, that temptation to be drawn towards things we've had for a long time to give us comfort, is going to always try to draw our attention. And Jesus is saying that if you love me more than these, do what I asked you. Share what you have found. Make a difference in someone else's life. Understand this isn't all about what you get. It's about what you can give and how you can make a difference. Because the key thing to understand in all of this is that what Jesus made abundantly clear is our relationship with God and our relationship with Jesus is not about religion. It's not about rituals. It's not about religious activities. It's not about any of those things. It's a relationship about love. That first, God loved us so much, he did the work to bring us closer to him. And if we can become aware of that and understand that, we begin to start to love God. But if we're in a relationship, and a relationship is actually anchored in love, true love provides evidence. In other words, true love has some kind of outcome. And the evidence of that loving relationship with God, if we're receiving the love of God, if we're consciously receiving the love of God, the evidence of that should be love for others. The Apostle John writes on this incredibly amount. He actually says it in kind of some really harsh ways sometimes. But if you're not being loving towards other people, if you're not prioritizing the well-being of other people, the Apostle John says, I don't want to hear about your love for God. That's the Apostle John. That's not me. I want to hear about your love for God. But the bottom line is that we are called to make a difference in other people's lives. And honestly, I think the reason Jesus does this 3 times, if you love me, take action. If you love me, take action. If you love me, take action. I think Jesus always knew that human beings would be drawn to religious activities over caring for people. And Jesus wanted to make it abundantly clear that that is not the point. The point is caring for and serving others. That the gift we receive because of Jesus is best experienced when we share it. Because I think the most important thing that any of us can do is to take active steps to help other people grow in their relationship with God. And that includes tons of things. Of course, that includes taking care of people's physical needs. If you know people who are having trouble eating, make sure they can eat. Or if people have trouble meeting their physical needs, be involved in that. But also, there are people that you have a relationship with that you can reach the way no one else can. Right? In a way that I never can. Be willing to just share why you have hope. Don't berate people. Don't be one of those scary people. But live in the confidence of the hope that you have. And if someone asks you about why do you have so much hope, be willing to share it. And the best way to demonstrate that we have hope is to be others focused, to serve other people expecting nothing in return. That's how we stand out. The key point that Jesus is making is that the thing that we celebrate on Easter is not just about what we get. That is a beginning. Our expression of faith moves us closer to God. But it's also a starting point. It's a starting point of a journey of actually growing in our faith and reaching out and impacting others' lives. Because my friends, as we read the gospel accounts, right, as we read the book of Matthew, who was written by a guy who was there with Jesus, as we read the book of John, who was written by a guy who was there with Jesus, as we read the book of Mark, who was a follower of Peter, who was there with Jesus, as we read the book of Luke, a doctor who had researched the whole thing and wrote it out, they all tell us the same thing, that our faith is not the destination. It's just a starting point. It's a starting point built on love. It's a starting point to be called out to make a difference for other people. My friends, Easter is an incredible gift. God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Jesus, The work of Jesus on Easter restored our relationship with God. Let's embrace that relationship, not for what it does for us, but for what we can do for other people, what we can do in other people's lives. What's that thing on your mind right now that you feel like you can make a difference with, and you're just kind of a little afraid to take that step? Whatever that thing is, do it. Do it. Do it tomorrow. Don't wait anymore. You are uniquely created. You will do things in a way that no one else will. And we kind of sit back because we're kind of afraid, and that's okay. Big things are scary. But you were created for more. You were created to make a difference. Each and every one of us here has a chance to change lives, and you will change lives differently than I do. Embrace that. Step into it. That's the gift of Easter. That we are reconciled with God. We have this closer connection to God than we can possibly imagine. And if we will embrace that, if you will embrace that, you will be part of changing the world.